Fitz, give me your first wide receiver sleeper.
It's Jahan Dotson of the Washington Commanders, and Dotson was undeniably disappointing last year. 49 catches, 518 yards, 4 touchdowns over 17 games. The quality of quarterbacking was pretty iffy. Sam Howell did throw the ball around quite a bit at one point midway through the season. He was leading the NFL in pass attempts, but it seemed like he was much more comfortable throwing to the middle of the field and not so much to the sidelines. Jahan Dotson was primarily working outside, and so it seemed like it just wasn't a good fit. He was kind of left out of the target bonanza that Washington had going on. And then at the end of the season, Howell completely fell apart. So just not optimal. But we saw Dotson hit pretty well in his rookie year in 2022. Missed some time due to injury, but he had 7 touchdowns in 12 games, averaged 14.9 yards per catch and 8.6 yards per target. Not bad considering that Carson Wentz and Taylor Heineke were his quarterbacks that year. Now he's getting the big QB upgrade with Jaden Daniels. On paper, the Washington defense doesn't look great, so maybe we get a lot of pass-happy game scripts for the Commanders, much like LSU had last year with Jaden Daniels, where their defense was terrible, the passing game was clicking, and every game was just a shootout. So I think the upside for Jahan Dotson this year would be that he is the Robin to Terry McLaurin's Batman, and look, Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas combined for 31 touchdowns in 13 games with Jaden Daniels last year. That's not happening. McLaurin and Dotson are not scoring 31 touchdowns, but they could do 20, right? Over 17 games. So maybe the ceiling for Dotson looks something like 70 catches, 1,000 yards, 9 touchdowns. But the worst case scenario, I guess, is that Daniel struggles in his rookie year and Dotson's target share doesn't really increase over 2023. It remains as low as it did last year. In which case, another year of disappointment.
By the time we got to the end of draft season last year, Dotson was one of my favorite, and I think one of a lot of people's favorite kind of mid-round picks. He was a guy that, and in fact, was creeping up ADP enough that he was starting to become like an early mid-round pick and not even a guy you could get later on, because there was just a lot of helium for him in August last year. And I think it's understandable if some folks maybe feel like a little burned by that. His ADP right now, though, is in like the low 50s or high 60s at the position. That's a very attainable player for the upside that you're kind of laying out. Erickson, what do you think about Dotson?
Yeah, Dotson is one of those players where you kind of see him in the rankings, you're like, oh, I forgot about this guy because you got burned by him last year. So you're like, I can't go back to that player. I mean, he was drafted ahead of Mike Evans, right? Looking back at that, you're like, oh my God, I can't believe I drafted Jahan Dotson in front of Mike Evans. But I think one of the other things that I think Fitz maybe briefly mentioned was, so Curtis Samuel is gone. And there were some splits in what was the positive part of last year, which there wasn't a lot of, but in some of this time in games that Curtis Samuel missed, you saw Jahan Dotson more involved. I know against my Patriots, he had a really productive game. I believe Curtis Samuel didn't play in that game. So Curtis Samuel's obviously with the Buffalo Bills. So unless we're expecting Luke McCaffrey to come in and command a high target share as a 3rd-round pick in the slot, Jahan Dotson, maybe now he spends a little bit more time inside alongside with Terry McLaurin, with obviously Jaden Daniels, hopefully adding an upgrade to the quarterback play.
One of the reasons why I wanted to start with Dotson is because I thought, this applies to everybody in terms of we're picking high upside sleepers, so there's going to be a wide range of outcomes. But I felt like Dotson was maybe the biggest gap between what I could see his best case scenario playing out as and what his worst. First of all, worst case scenario for every one of these guys is injury. So that's obviously excluding that. Right. It feels like his worst case scenario is lower than a lot of these other guys, while having just as high of a best case scenario. Is that a fair assessment, do you think, Fitz?
Yeah, I think so. In the worst case, that's part of the thing. Injury can derail anyone. But here, it's hard to see Dotson not getting an increase in target share with Samuel gone. And the guys who could maybe cut into it a little bit are rookies. Luke McCaffrey, who Erickson just mentioned, and Ben Sinnott, the tight end. So it's hard to see Dotson not playing a pretty substantial role in this offense, I think.
Even coming off of his bad year last year, I still will never forget how badly he torched Maryland's secondary in a game I was at when they were hosting Penn State, and he's just like the greatest receiver of all time in my mind, based off that one performance. Erickson, let's go to your first wide receiver here.
Well, speaking of injuries, Christian Watson. So when it comes to Watson, the worst case scenario is basically what happened last year, where the hamstring injuries just absolutely nuke him again. But even if he is healthy, now heading into last year, it was like Christian Watson versus a bunch of no-name guys and rookies. Well, it turns out a lot of those no-name guys and rookies are actually pretty good. So it's no longer, oh, Watson just shows up and he's the number one guy. It's like, oh, no, he actually has to go out, stay healthy, and earn actual targets. So even if he is healthy in 2024, the concern is, well, Jordan Love just continues to spread the wealth. He spreads the targets between Watson and Jaden Reed and Romeo Doubs and Dontavian Wicks and the two tight ends. So even though it looked like, oh, this guy's going to see 30% target share, easy, no longer the case in part of his worst case scenario heading into 2024. But best case scenario is that a healthy Christian Watson, who he may have never been healthy at all last year. Like, we won't actually know, because every time that he played, it seemed like he was going to pull his hamstring every other route that he ran. So the best case scenario is that he stays healthy, but that he does emerge as that clear-cut number one wide receiver like he did as a rookie. You know, from week 10 onward from his rookie season, he was a wide receiver 9. Overall in fantasy points scored. And he's someone that also has a presence in the red zone. Just this past season, when he was healthy, 13 red zone targets in just 9 games. He had 15 end zone targets during the regular season and postseason combined, which ranks 6th most at the position. So I'm not a huge believer in Romeo Doubs, to be honest. Like, I think that talent-wise, Watson is much better than him. I do like Jaden Reed a lot. I do like Tucker Kraft a lot. Talked about him as a deep sleeper. So, yeah, it's going to be tough for Watson necessarily to come in here and be the number one target in this offense. But from an efficiency standpoint, like, Christian Watson offers, I think, a skill set that not a lot of these other guys offer necessarily, with the speed and size and what he flashed his rookie year. So, again, if we can just get him healthy. Like, if you look at his last 15 games, basically, so this year, in the previous year for his rookie campaign, 13.3 fantasy points per game over his last 15 games that he's basically played like a full snap share. That's the same amount of points that Jamar Chase scored in 2023. Like, that's the type of ceiling we're looking at when it comes to Christian Watson, especially because he scores a ton of touchdowns and he's a big play threat. So Watson, to me, is one of these ultimate boomer bust receivers, and he's like one of these, I kind of view him as like a wide receiver firewall, where in rankings and ADP, he's like the last receiver I like click on, then I'm like, well, we just hit an avalanche, and now there's no other receivers I can draft with any type of confidence. Like, he's the last guy that I feel some semblance of, okay, I can see the path where he can deliver for me, but then after that, it really falls off a cliff.
Fitz, you're obviously a Packers guy. As a fan, how would you kind of rate the chances of Watson at the end of the season being the Green Bay Packers receiver to own?
I think it's a very plausible scenario that that's the case. This is a guy who in 2022 had 8 touchdowns over a 4-game stretch. And then last year he had 4 touchdowns over a 3-game stretch. Like, this guy, the only thing, and Erickson outlined this, is the target scenario is a little murky with all the competent pass catchers in Green Bay. But in best ball, I mean, getting that sort of touchdown upside, it's pretty sexy. Erickson, let me ask you, in your rankings, Jaden Reed and Christian Watson, is there a big gap between those two, or are they pretty close together?
I think I both of them have them in like that wide receiver 3 range. I know I've Reed higher just because of what he did last year as a rookie, and I liked him a lot as a prospect, and he obviously has shown that he can be a little bit more healthy. I think that his role is more concrete in the slot. So I'm just double checking right now, make sure I'm not talking out of my mouth. So yeah, Jaden Reed 38, and then Christian Watson 46. So yeah, in the wide receiver 3-4 range.
Okay.
Watson's ADP is wide receiver 43 right now in early drafts. So similar range there, but obviously with some real upside built in. Fitz, who is your next wide receiver?
Khalil Shakir of the Buffalo Bills. Between Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis, the Bills are losing 241 wide receiver targets. They signed Curtis Samuel in free agency, a useful receiver, but not really a high volume guy. Samuel's career high in targets for any season is 105. The Bills did draft Keon Coleman. I like Keon Coleman a lot. As you know, Worm, I'm very pro Keon Coleman. But even though I am pro Keon, I can't tell you that he's a bulletproof prospect. There's some blemishes on his college production profile. He's not an exceptional separator, and he's a second-round pick. not an early first-round pick, one of these can't-miss guys like Malik Neighbors, Roma Dunze, Marvin Harrison Jr. And by the way, I can't even imagine what it was like to be a Bills fan on draft night where the Bills keep trading down to teams that take wide receivers. I'm sure they were apoplectic until the Bills actually took one on day 2. Anyway, Shakir didn't really draw a ton of targets last year, only 45 during the regular season, but he was highly efficient with those targets, 15.7 yards per catch, 13.6 yards per target, really good numbers there. And he started playing more snaps and drawing more targets down the stretch. He had a touchdown catch in each of the Bills' 2 playoff games and a team-high 9 targets and 7 catches in the divisional round loss to the Chiefs. So I think the upside for Shakir this year would be if Coleman isn't quite ready for prime time and Samuel continues to play kind of a peripheral role, I think Shakir could lead the Bills in wide receiver targets. And Dalton Kincaid, we're expecting him to have a pretty big role, but maybe those are the 2 primary guys in this offense. In the passing game, I don't think a 75 catch, 1,000-yard season is out of the question. Worst case scenario, Coleman pops right away. It turns out to be a monster. And the passing game sort of runs through Coleman and Kincaid. Shakir's once again a 3rd or 4th wheel.
Fitz, this is like sort of a half-baked idea that popped in my head as you were talking. So feel free to say like I'm wrong and dumb and did not think this through. Do we as an industry move on from receivers too quickly now that don't break out by the end of year 2? Because we see so many talented receivers coming into the NFL every year now. And a lot of these like high-level rookies especially will break out in like the back half of year 1. And if not in year 1, it's like year 2, they've really established themselves as like a really viable fantasy asset. That I feel like, I remember growing up, it used to be the notion of like year 3 was the year for receivers. And it feels like that's gotten earlier and earlier. So these guys who have talent and maybe even opportunity, like it seems like Shakir has, but who haven't quite had that true breakout yet prior to year 3, often get overlooked. Do you think that's a fair thought or is that too half-baked?
There has been a paradigm shift. I mean, back in the good Lord, the 1990s or whatever, it used to be like, target the year 3 wide receivers who, they've sort of served their apprenticeship. They're ready to break out, and rookie receivers were kind of a sucker play. That's really changed. So let me answer your question with a question, Worm. Are you interested in drafting Terrace Marshall this year?
I am not. I had him actually I got him in a number of rookie drafts, a couple of years ago. But he's not, at this stage, it seems like clear that he's not going to take the step that I had hoped he would. And so I'm not interested in him. So I think that's, a fair comparison. Erickson, what do you think about that?
Isn't Terrace Marshall entering year 4? I
actually don't remember.
Wasn't he drafted?
Is it 4?
I don't know. Well, yeah. The player I was thinking about was Elijah Moore as another like player that I was on last year entering year 3, I believe. And then, he flamed out. And then, unless your name is Jerry Jeudy, basically, you could just continue to flame out wherever you go. And somehow, the Browns just giving out contracts left and right that they definitely don't regret. So, I think that the way that the college game has evolved, that's why you're seeing more receivers hitting the ground running. And I think that teams also tell us that they're expecting receivers to produce sooner. And there's a reason why if the Bills felt so strongly about Shakir, then why did they sign Curtis Samuel? Why did they draft Keon Coleman? Clearly, they obviously will take what they can get from Shakir, but he was still a 5th-round pick. So, again, I obviously, Fitz is not saying, Shakir's locked and loaded. Shakir is obviously an upside play. I totally understand that. But from the team's perspective, NFL teams can't lie to us by the moves that they make in free agency and the NFL draft. They invested into the wide receiver position. Obviously, they needed to replace Diggs and Gabe Davis. But at the same time, what type of capital they spend does matter.
Marshall was drafted in 2021, which means he is going to year 4, which is really wild to think that.
Nobody was drafting him last year either.
Even grosser than, the point still remains, but he's even grosser than I thought. All right, Erickson, who is your last wide receiver sleeper?
I'm going to go with Brian Thomas Jr. for the Jacksonville Jaguars, 1st-round pick. And so the worst case scenario with Brian Thomas is he ends up in Jacksonville and he just never really becomes like the focal point of the passing game, where he basically fits that better in real life wide receiver fit versus better in fantasy football, because Brian Thomas Jr., what he did at LSU, like field stretcher, deep threat, like that's what his best quality was. He was scoring a bunch of touchdowns on long plays, and that may or may not work in fantasy football, especially with the way that two high safeties are deployed. Like, you don't see teams dropping back and dropping dimes all day long to score points. It works in college, but not necessarily in the NFL. So that's a concern for Brian Thomas. And also, Gabe Davis is there. They did pay Gabe Davis. Gabe Davis knows the wide receiver coach in Jacksonville. So if Brian Thomas Jr. is like losing snaps to Gabe Davis, then yeah, that's definitely the worst case scenario. Because if Gabe Davis can't get targets and he's playing ahead of Brian Thomas, then that's a big concern. But on the best case scenario side for Brian Thomas is Trevor Lawrence loves to attack downfield. Like, that is something that he loves, and we saw it last year to mixed reviews with Calvin Ridley, who I don't think is a natural deep threat per se, but I mean, a lot of those balls thrown a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, Calvin Ridley doesn't drop it, and then Trevor Lawrence's numbers look way different. So it's a scheme fit that I think works with the quarterback in place at Trevor Lawrence, who we've seen fuel fantasy producers. Even guys like Zay Jones been productive. Christian Kirk has been productive. Ridley, again, up and down, but still had spike weeks. And I think ultimately that's what Brian Thomas looks like a lot of, is a spiked week, splash week potential player. And I think that the best case scenario with him, specifically just looking at this offense, there's over 200 targets available that have vacated this offense from the losses of both Calvin Ridley and Zay Jones. And we look at Ridley's role last year as that perimeter kind of outside wide receiver. He had nearly 1,800 air yards, 23% target share, 36% air yard share, and he was the NFL leader in end zone targets last year. Wide receiver 10 expected fantasy points per game. So if you basically just like plop in Brian Thomas Jr. and he takes on this Calvin Ridley role, you say that Gabe Davis takes on Zay Jones's role, and then Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram stayed the same, relatively speaking, then you're looking at a really productive and lucrative role for Brian Thomas to produce from the get-go. And I don't think a lot of people view this landing spot as that, but there is a path where this is actually a grandioso type of landing spot for Brian Thomas. And I think that gives him a lot of upside. So for me, I think we could see him get over 100 targets just based on the fact that there's so many vacated targets from last year between Ridley and Zay Jones leaving this offense. And when you just look at historically, like rookie receivers that get over 100 targets, they've well exceeded expectations. So if I was to make a prediction about Brian Thomas, it would be that maybe he doesn't lead the Jaguars in targets, but in receiving yards specifically, I think that you could see that from him if he's specifically used downfield and it's just Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram eating underneath.
Fitz, I want to get your opinion on this. You know from talking with me on the Dynasty show that I'm on record as saying I did not dislike the landing spot, and I've been a little confused with Brian Thomas falling like into the second round in Superflex rookie drafts. I think he's a talented player. He was wide receiver 4 coming into the draft, and I don't think this landing spot is such that he should drop that far beyond that. That's been through the Dynasty prism, though. I haven't really considered him as somebody that I'll be rostering a lot of in redraft, and I'm not really sure I can articulate why I haven't considered him that way, because Erickson, I think, lays out a really compelling case. What do you make of Brian Thomas Fitz specifically in redraft?
I'm having a hard time assessing him too, Worm, because I think the target outlook is pretty murky. It does help that they release Zay Jones, but in addition to Christian Kirk and Gabe Davis being there, you've got a tight end who caught more than 100 balls last year. So I think Erickson kind of hit it on the head with these spike weeks, and that's what we're looking for out of Brian Thomas. And hopefully he gives you spike weeks often enough that you can consider playing him, starting him in a managed league. But I think he's going to be kind of a nightmare to handle in managed leagues, quite honestly, where you just don't know when the spike week is coming, if it's coming. And, you know, if you start him and don't get it, are you looking at 2 catches for 23 yards?
Erickson, you are, for the record, ranking Brian Thomas much higher than the rest of the Fantasy Pros team. As of the most recent updates, which is not, updated for everybody, Debro and Fitz have him in the low 60s. You've got him in the high 30s. You've got him 39. So you are ranking him aggressively in addition to seeing the upside here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that just being over bullish on first round wide receivers more often than not works out. Even last year, look, so we had 4 receivers drafted in the first round last year. 3 of them I would say were hits, and one of them was obviously a colossal bust, but that's 3 out of 4, right? That's coming out in the green. So I'm not guaranteeing that Brian Thomas is going to be a top 40 wide receiver, but if I'm taking shots like, okay, do I want to take Brian Thomas or go down the Cooper Kupp train again? Like the guy we just haven't seen the eliteness from him in a while, or a player like Deontay Johnson, where Deontay, in a managed league, you feel much better about starting him every week, but we've been down this road with Deontay where it's like the guy's going to be wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 every single week. So again, I think it's in this part of the draft, in the rankings, where you are trying to layer in and balance out upside versus floor, which is always hard to do in linear rankings. But that's why you come to the shows, to get the analysis behind the rankings.
Of course. Everybody continue to listen to shows, please, and thank you. The NFL draft is over and the teams are set. It's time to start looking ahead to the NFL season with DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. Get a jump start on the season with futures bets on division winners, win totals, stat leaders, and so much more. Explore the latest odds on which rookies will have the most passing or receiving yards, or check out futures for your favorite teams and players on the DraftKings Sportsbook app. I was looking over the early odds on DraftKings for the Super Bowl earlier this week. The Chiefs, of course, lead the way at plus 550, 49ers right behind them at plus 600, then my Ravens at plus 900. I don't find that one quite as disrespectful as I did Lamar having only the 5th best MVP odds. I think this one makes more sense. The Lions and Bills round out the top 5, both at plus 1200. Quite honestly, if Patrick Mahomes is healthy in January, it's hard not to like the Chiefs, even as the shortest odds, because it's Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs at plus 550. It's going to be way better than that by the time you get to January. However you plan to bet your NFL futures, download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and use code FantasyPros. New customers bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets instantly. That's code FantasyPros only on DraftKings. The crown is yours.